Yamamoto's confidence in the invincibility of his Zero fighters and the superiority of Japanese tactics was complete. His escort of seasoned pilots, flying nimble and deadly Mitsubishi Zeros, would normally ensure his safety. Yet the Americans had studied every detail. The range of the aircraft, the speed of the formation, the time it would take to reach the target. Every factor was calculated, leaving no room for error, but offering the slim chance of a historic success. In the weeks leading up to April 18, the American planners pored over maps, charts, and reports. Pilots trained relentlessly, practicing long-range navigation over open water, mastering the quirks of the twin-engine P-38 Lightning, the only fighter capable of escorting them on such an extended mission. Mechanics tested every engine, adjusted every instrument, and refined every detail. The stakes were clear. One of the most audacious missions in the Pacific War, if successful, could demoralize the Japanese Navy, alter operational priorities, and reshape the trajectory of the conflict. The strategic backdrop was stock. Japan clung to territory it could barely defend. Its fleets were powerful but overstretched. American forces were growing stronger, smarter, and more aggressive. And in this vast, unforgiving theatre, a single man, Yamamoto, stood as both a target and a symbol. The coming flight would test every innovation, every calculation, and every ounce of courage the Americans could muster. And as the sun rose over Guadalcanal on that fateful April morning, the pieces were falling into place for a confrontation that would send shockwaves across the Pacific. The pilots of the 339th Fighter Squadron, aware of the mission's magnitude, tightened their grips on the throttles. Every mile flown brought them closer to history. The mission to intercept Admiral Yamamoto was unprecedented. For the Americans, it was not just a strike. It was a test of precision, endurance, and courage. Once the decrypted Japanese messages revealed Yamamoto's inspection flight from Rabaul to Balear Island, planners at Pearl Harbor began designing what would later be known as Operation Vengeance. The task was clear: fly over 400 miles of open ocean, locate Yamamoto's formation, and engage without warning. The slightest error in navigation or timing would doom the mission. Pilots assigned to the 339th Fighter Squadron spent hours studying maps, practicing long-range navigation, and simulating intercepts over water. They trained to maintain radio silence, fly in tight formations, and execute split-second aerial maneuvers. Each P-38 Lightning, with its distinctive twin-boom design, was chosen for its range, speed, and firepower. Mechanics ensured the aircraft were flawless, knowing that even minor mechanical issues could be fatal hundreds of miles from land. The human element weighed heavily. Lieutenant Rex Barber, Captain Thomas Lanphier, and the other pilots were young men confronting a mission that could make or break their careers and their lives. Fatigue, nerves, and the vast expanse of ocean pressed on them as they mentally rehearsed each maneuver. Above them, Yamamoto's G4M Burma, escorted by seasoned Zeros, flew unaware of the trap being laid. The Americans knew the operation would be remembered not just for its audacity, but for its precision, a perfect alignment of intelligence, skill, and courage. Every calculation, every briefing, and every pre-flight check was part of a larger gamble. And as the pilots climbed into their cockpits that morning, throttles open and eyes fixed on the horizon, history was waiting. The sky over the Solomons held a deadly secret, and the next chapter would unfold in speed, fear, and consequence. For the American pilots, the mission was both exhilarating and terrifying. Lieutenant Rex Barber and Captain Thomas Lanphier were young men, trained to fight, but not to perform feats that pushed the limits of human endurance. Flying over 400 miles of open ocean in single-seat P-38 Lightnings, they had no margin for error. Fatigue weighed on their shoulders, every calculation, every compass reading, every adjustment noted. They carried the knowledge that success could alter the course of the Pacific War, but failure meant death or capture deep in enemy territory. Yamamoto himself embodied a different kind of human story. A decorated strategist, he was meticulous, confident, and daring. On April 18, 1943, he flew in his Mitsubishi G4 Emibeti Boma with the calm authority of a man who believed in his own invincibility. His crew trusted him implicitly, unaware that every transmission he made was being decrypted, every movement tracked, and that an ambush waited hundreds of miles ahead. The human tension, the pilot's fear versus the admiral's confidence, would define the encounter. The P-38 Lightning was uniquely suited for the mission. Its twin engines, extended range, and concentrated firepower made it capable of a long-range intercept that no other Allied fighter could attempt. Yet technology alone could not guarantee success. Pilots had to master the quirks of the aircraft, including its high-speed handling, radio silence operations, and fuel management over hundreds of miles of ocean. On the Japanese side, the Mitsubishi G4M bomber was fast but lightly armoured, a design choice prioritizing speed over protection. The escorting Zeros were nimble and deadly, but their range was limited, and they could be overwhelmed by well-coordinated strikes. The Americans' understanding of both aircraft types, derived from intelligence reports and prior combat experience, was critical. Technology was not just a tool, it was a weapon that demanded human precision to be effective. Yamamoto's leadership style combined charisma, intellect, and audacity. He believed that visible inspections boosted morale and allowed him to oversee operations personally. Yet this very leadership decision exposed him to unprecedented risk. His presence on the flight made him a symbolic target, and the Americans recognized the strategic advantage of removing him from the equation. On the US side, Admiral Chester Nimitz and Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher made the difficult decisions to authorize a mission that many considered reckless. Commanders trusted their intelligence officers and the skill of their pilots, but understood the cost of failure. Leadership in this context was a balance between opportunity and danger, a calculus that would be tested in the skies over the Solomons. The mission to intercept Yamamoto was a masterpiece of tactical precision. Every detail had to be accounted for: flight path, altitude, timing, and engagement strategy. The P-38s flew low over the ocean to avoid radar detection, using precise navigation to intersect Yamamoto's flight at exactly the right moment. The plan relied on a combination of intelligence skill and exact timing. American pilots were briefed to approach in a tight V formation, strike quickly, and disengage before the Japanese escort could respond effectively. The challenge was immense: miscalculate by even a few miles, and the Admiral would slip through. The operation showcased the marriage of planning and execution, where human skill and technological advantage converged in a single, decisive moment. The Japanese forces, confident in the invincibility of their air superiority, were unaware of the threat overhead. Yamamoto's bomber formation, protected by experienced Zeros, was formidable in conventional engagements. Yet their reliance on predictable flight patterns, routine communications, and the assumption that Americans could not reach them across such distances made them vulnerable. The very efficiency of Japanese air operations, speed, coordination, and confidence became a weakness. The Americans exploited these vulnerabilities through intelligence, meticulous planning, and a willingness to push their machines and skills to the limit. The mission highlighted a critical truth of warfare. Even the most revered and prepared forces could be undone by information, timing, and audacity. There was a profound moral dimension to the mission. Yamamoto was more than a general. He was a symbol of Japanese naval power and pride. Targeting him carried ethical and psychological weight. The Americans understood that his death could demoralize Japan and shift the strategic balance, but it also meant intentionally killing a figure of immense symbolic value. For the pilots, the knowledge that they were striking a man revered by an entire nation added gravity to their task. There was no room for hesitation. Precision was not just tactical, but moral too. The mission became a study in the difficult ethical decisions of war, where strategic necessity intersects with human conscience. April 18, 1943. The sun had barely risen over the Solomon Islands when 6 P-38 Lightnings lifted from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. The pilots, Lieutenant Rex Barber, Captain Thomas Lanphier, and their companions felt the weight of history pressing on their shoulders. Over 400 miles of open ocean lay between them and their target. Radio silence was absolute. Every sound, the roar of engines, the slap of wind against the fuselage, reminded them that any mistake could be fatal. High above, Admiral Yamamoto's Mitsubishi G4M bomber traced a routine inspection route, escorted by 6 nimble Zero fighters. Inside the bomber, Yamamoto maintained his composure, reviewing schedules and discussing logistics with his staff. Confidence radiated from him. He had flown countless missions and survived the hazards of the Pacific theatre. Yet even his experience could not account for the unseen threat closing in from the horizon. The American pilots followed meticulously plotted coordinates, flying low to avoid detection, navigating by compass, clouds, and subtle ocean cues. At 9:30, as predicted, they sighted the Japanese formation over Bougainville. The P-38s ascended swiftly, engines screaming, closing the distance in a precise attack window of less than 10 minutes. Timing was everything. The formation's predictable path allowed the Americans to position themselves above and behind the bombers. In a flash, the sky erupted. The P-38 split into attack positions. Barber and Lanfear targeted Yamamoto's bomber, while the others engaged the escorting Zeros, forcing them into defensive maneuvers. Tracer fire streaked across the air, sunlight glinting off fuselage and wingtip. The Abeti attempted evasive maneuvers, but it was slower in lesser mode than the nimble P-38s. Inside, Yamamoto and his staff braced for impact, their confidence colliding with chaos. The Americans fired with precision. Tracers struck engines and fuselage, tearing the boomerang apart. Flames erupted, smoke trailing into the sky. Pilots reported seeing the aircraft break apart, crew members thrown into the void. The escorting Zeros attempted to retaliate, but the P-38's superior positioning and firepower allowed them to disengage. Within minutes, the sky was silent again, save for the distant echo of engines fading toward Guadalcanal. Barber's eyes followed the descending wreckage. There was no celebration in the cockpit, only the sobering realization of the magnitude of their strike. Yamamoto, the mastermind of Pearl Harbor in symbol of Japanese naval might, was gone. For the Americans, the mission had been executed with near-perfect precision. Every calculation, every risk taken, had paid off. News of the engagement would take hours to reach Japanese command, but its impact was immediate in the minds of those who had carried it out. The tension of planning, the dread over long flights, and the meticulous execution had converged in a single, decisive moment. In the Pacific sky that morning, skill, intelligence, and courage had intersected with fate, delivering a blow that would reverberate across the Japanese empire. The sky over Bougainville cleared in the wake of the engagement, leaving only the acrid scent of aviation fuel and smoke in memory. The 6 P-38 Lightnings, engines humming steadily, began their long journey back to Guadalcanal. The pilots were quiet, absorbed in their thoughts. Each man understood the enormity of what had just occurred. Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, commander of the combined fleet, a figure whose name carried awe and fear across the Pacific, had been struck down by a handful of American fighters operating with near-impossible precision. Lieutenant Rex Barber recounted the final moments. The bomber trailing smoke, crew members trapped inside, Yamamoto himself slumped over as the aircraft spiraled downward. The reality was chilling. For the Americans, the mission's success was tempered by the stark confrontation with mortality. History had been made, but it was written in fire and human lives. Meanwhile, Japanese forces were still unaware. Reports from the field trickled into headquarters hours later, carrying the first whispers of disaster. The initial shock was disbelief. The admiral, untouchable in their minds, had been killed in a sudden surgical strike. Panic and grief rippled through the ranks. Officers debated whether this loss was tactical, strategic, or symbolic. It was all three. Yamamoto was not only a commander but a morale anchor. His death created an immediate vacuum of authority, leaving subordinates scrambling to adjust plans, delay operations, and maintain cohesion. Back at Guadalcanal, the returning pilots were greeted with cautious celebration. There were no parades, no fanfare, just the sober acknowledgement of a mission accomplished. Radio reports confirmed the intelligence had been accurate. Japanese transmissions had verified the loss of Yamamoto and key staff. Admiral Nimitz and his commanders allowed themselves a rare private moment of relief. The mission's precision had validated months of painstaking planning, training, and code-breaking work. Every risk had been calculated, and every gamble had paid off. Strategically, the impact was immediate. Japanese naval operations became more cautious. Plans for offensive maneuvers in the Solomons were delayed, and fleet movements were re-evaluated under the shadow of uncertainty. Yamamoto's death also resonated with psychological intensity. Japanese propaganda had long portrayed him as invincible. His loss undermined morale and served as a grim reminder that even the most revered figures were not immune to the reach of American ingenuity and determination. For the American pilots, the return flight was reflective, almost surreal. They had faced overwhelming odds, relied on split-second timing, and operated in a theatre where a single miscalculation could mean death. Yet they had executed the impossible. The skies that morning had tested skill, courage, and human resolve, and history had shifted in a matter of minutes. By evening, word of the operation began to spread through Allied command. Reports highlighted the unprecedented nature of the mission. The use of decrypted intelligence to eliminate a high-value target, the daring execution by a small squadron of pilots, and the far-reaching implications for the Pacific campaign. Historians would later describe it as one of the most precise and audacious strikes of World War II, a mission where preparation, intelligence, and human courage converged in perfect alignment. The Pacific had changed in a single morning. A symbol of Japanese naval power was gone. The skies above the Solomons, once filled with tension and uncertainty, now held the quiet aftermath of a moment that would resonate across the war. The stage was set for the consequences, both immediate and long-term, that would ripple through strategy, morale, and the hearts of men on both sides. On both sides. The news of Admiral Yamamoto's death struck Japan like a thunderbolt. Across naval headquarters and garrisons, disbelief turned to grief. The Pacific War would continue, vast and brutal, but the events of that day served as a profound reminder, even in the expanse of conflict, the decisions of a few can echo across nations, shape destinies, and transform the course of history forever. And so, as the sun rose and fell over the waves, the memory of that morning remained, a moment where skill met fate, and where courage carved its mark into the pages of time.